Okay, so we're rolling, and I want to thank everyone again for joining in or viewing if you're on YouTube right now. For those of you who don't know me at this point, my name is Taryn Callion. I work with Nullify's Customer Success and Advisor Partnership Programs. And this is part 5 of our CCAN certification program to become a Knowify Advisor. And we will be covering the integration between QuickBooks and Nullify. I know in my previous 4 webinars, I touched base on this a little bit as it was case specific, how material costing works with Nullify, with QuickBooks, how labor costing works with QuickBooks, contract management and invoicing, how that works with QuickBooks. But this is where I'm going to be getting into a little bit more detail, a little bit more of case specific integration features, and some special features that can have to be enabled by our support team that are very often requested by advisors that work with Knowify and their clients. And just to give you a quick little list of what we're going to be covering with this webinar, the first thing we're going to be discussing is connecting Knowify to your QuickBooks account and kind of how you set up that connection, how we'll set up the sync, and just kind of the initial kickoff of having Knowify and QuickBooks communicate with one another. Then I'll be getting into a little bit of high-level information on expenses slash costs, our income and revenue, our labor, and how that's all going to be syncing with your QuickBooks account. Again, these are all categories that I really did cover in previous webinars, but I'm going to reiterate some of the information and maybe give you guys a little bit more info that wasn't included previously. Also give you a little bit more information on how we work with classes and locations with QuickBooks. It's something that's asked pretty often for people who get very in-depth with their tracking in their QuickBooks accounts. So I just wanted to make sure that I gave everyone a little bit more information on how that's going to work. And then towards the end, I'll be covering any of our, I call them bonus features. They're just features that need to be activated by our support team to give you a little bit more functionality in the QuickBooks integration with Knowify. But first, we're just going to get into, as I mentioned, connecting Knowify to your QuickBooks account. One thing I always like to bring up is that it's best to connect Knowify to QuickBooks through Knowify. I know a lot of times people will try to connect through apps.com, and that will work in some cases, but we've found that you get the most success if you can connect through Knowify. It'll actually be the first step if you're setting up a new Knowify account when you're going through your initial login and account setup. It'll say, do you want to connect to QuickBooks? You just choose yes, import data now. You log into your QuickBooks account and it'll automatically start importing any data. It can also be done through your admin section. So if you've skipped that part through setup, that's fine. You can always double back on anything done in setup when you're actually live with the account in your admin section. And what the initial connection will pull is all of your clients and vendors, your products and services from QuickBooks, and then other accounting-based items like your chart of accounts, classes, locations, tax rates. It will also pull your list of employees. And it basically just pulls data into Knowify to populate it with some information for you to use while you're in your test mode and just learning how Knowify works. And that's going to be a good segue into our test versus live discussion here. When you first start a Knowify account, we put it in what we call test mode. This means that we're going to be pulling data from QuickBooks, mainly with that initial sync that I just described. But it won't actually push anything back to QuickBooks. And we do this so that either your clients or you can use Knowify without actually messing up anything in QuickBooks while you run through some test projects and just get a feel for how the system works. This way you can kind of just make a mess out of Knowify, run fake projects, create fake invoices, costs, whatever it's going to be. And then once you're comfortable using the system, you switch from test to live mode. Now, once you're in live mode, everything will push from Knowify to QuickBooks in real time, as needed. But when you make the switch from test to live, Knowify also prompts you to clear out your account data before moving forward. Basically, we do this just to guarantee that everything's synced up between your Knowify and QuickBooks account when you're getting started. So anything that happened while you're in test mode in Knowify or QuickBooks that may not line up will be able to just be completely erased and re-imported from QuickBooks from scratch again. So we know that starting from the day you're in live mode and everything's already going to be syncing up moving forward, at that point that we make the switch, everything is synced. And the simple explanation of what it's doing is wiping out every piece of job, client, vendor data from your Knowify account. It does keep all of your settings, so you don't have to reset up Knowify switching from test to live, but basically it just wipes everything clean, pulls it from QuickBooks, and guarantees that what you have in Knowify is matching what you have in QuickBooks. And when you first set up this connection, you'll see this little warning in the bottom right corner of Knowify with a QuickBooks icon that says Set Up Sync. This will take you through some of the highest level and most basic mapping of Knowify to QuickBooks, just to guarantee that once you start using Knowify and syncing all the data across, it pushes everything into the correct account, so you don't have to go back and retroactively set this information and then edit anything. It just makes it so you have at least a basic idea of where everything from Knowify is going to end up in your QuickBooks account. I'll also mention that once you have the sync set up, instead of saying set up sync there, it'll say sync now, but I'll get into a little bit more of that in a later slide. Now here's one of the biggest things that's asked when it comes to Knowify, and it's what syncs between Knowify and QuickBooks. And so I'm just going to go through a quick little rundown of not just what's syncing, because obviously that can be answered very simply with this checklist, but I just wanted to give a little bit more information on this sync and on each of these lines. So you'll notice that right off the bat, clients and vendors and then products and services are bidirectional. This isn't just the idea of, oh, well, I added a new client in Knowify, so it added to QuickBooks, or I added a new vendor in QuickBooks, so it added to Knowify. But it's really something that has to be automated to make sure that everything syncs up appropriately when you have any transactions with that client or with that vendor. So these are the types of transactions that you don't really have an option of whether or not you want it to sync, because you really want it to sync to make sure that both systems can talk to each other seamlessly. So if you change the name of a client in Knowify, we don't want it to be optional to change in QuickBooks. You want to make sure that QuickBooks has the same name so you can run reports and get all of your invoicing correct in QuickBooks. And the same goes with vendors, and then the same will go with products and services, since obviously they rely very heavily on that for running a lot of their reports. Now keep in mind that any of these changes or adds or disables from Knowify automatically go to QuickBooks. From QuickBooks to Knowify, it will need to be triggered. Again, this is something I'll get into a little bit more information on later on, but that's just something you'll always want to be wary of so you know that everything is lined up. Now when it comes to time, time is going to push from Knowify to QuickBooks. It's just going to be raw hours with the employees. We can't pull hours from QuickBooks to Knowify at this point in time. But that being said, we do pull from T-Sheets, which obviously these days is a QuickBooks product. So if that is a solution that you're using, you can reach out to our team. We'll give you more information on how to set it up. And as far as getting the employees from QuickBooks to Knowify works, we really do this so you can map up your Knowify users to which employees they represent in QuickBooks, so the time can end up on the right user. But you also can use this feature, this pull employees feature, to create users in Knowify, just so you don't have to re-enter information. It just automatically can generate what we call non-access users in Knowify, and then you can convert them to mobile access if necessary and just move everything forward from there. When it comes to expenses and bills, everything will sync from your Knowify account to QuickBooks. So if I log a cash expense or a credit card expense, if I enter a new vendor bill into Knowify, it'll automatically log into QuickBooks. But you'll see that this doesn't have an X next to QuickBooks to Knowify, representing that we don't do it at all. But this is something that's one of our bonus features that actually needs to be enabled by our team. I will be getting into these types of features a little bit later on, but it is possible. It just needs to be requested, and then I'm going to give you more information on how it's going to work once you have that set up. Invoices can only be pushed from Knowify to QuickBooks. I like to I'm just going to reiterate, we will not pull invoices from QuickBooks to Knowify. This is one of the few items that needs to be strictly one directional from Knowify to QuickBooks. Again, time as well, but with T-Sheets, that's kind of a little bit of a different situation. But since all of our contract management is managed in Knowify, and QuickBooks doesn't have that information, we need to make sure that the invoices are generated off the contract so we know how much is remaining, how much has been billed to date, and all of that. And so we prefer to just have all of the invoices generated from Knowify, pushed to QuickBooks. Once it's in QuickBooks, you have the ability to record a payment in QuickBooks, and that'll pull back to Knowify. You'll see that all of our payments are bidirectional. So anything that you record in Knowify, it's really just kind of a manual record. Yes, we paid this bill. Yes, the client paid this invoice, and it closes out in QuickBooks as well. But again, if you prefer to manage all of these cash flows in QuickBooks, they can always come back to Knowify, close out the bill or invoice that you created. One thing I will mention around payments is that we can't log payments that aren't against a bill or invoice. So, if you have something like a deposit against a job in QuickBooks that was just a cash payment that you plugged into QuickBooks, that can't pull into Knowify unless you have a deposit invoice to match it with. The last three items here are your chart of accounts, your tax rates and payment terms, and your classes and locations. Since these are all really accounting heavy items, we really can only pull them from QuickBooks to Knowify. With the exception of tax rates and payment terms, you actually don't really have classes, locations, or accounts in Knowify. So we only pull them in for the sake of mapping to QuickBooks to ensure that everything ends up in the right location in your QuickBooks account. Again, a lot of people do use Knowify without connecting to QuickBooks. So that's why we don't really have any way to create a chart of accounts. It's just something that is managed on the QuickBooks side. If you need that level of accounting, obviously you're going to want to connect Knowify to your QuickBooks account to make sure that you have all that syncing up. So what I'll get into next is syncing our costs or obviously expenses to QuickBooks. And I'm just kind of summarizing our defaults that we'll set. And again, I did cover this a lot in our material costing webinar. But the first thing Knowify will prompt you for is your accounts payable account. It's really just so we know where to push any of your bills or accounts payable items into QuickBooks. It's always the most simple one-for-one mapping. When we ask about a default expense account, what we're really saying is, if Knowify doesn't know anything else about this expense, what expense account do you want to be the absolute default? This can also be set at a vendor level, so it doesn't have to be the company level. This is where you can get more specific, where I could say, put all of my expenses into miscellaneous Knowify expenses, unless it's with Home Depot. In that case, assume it's a job material. It's just a way to get a little bit more functionality and a little bit more, I'll call it accurate, accounting from your Knowify transactions that are going to be pushed to QuickBooks. The same goes for default payment account. You can set a overall default that says, here's the bank account we usually use if nothing's specified. But again, I'll use Home Depot as the example. You can say, everything comes from our savings account unless it's from Home Depot, in which case we use our checking account. So that way you get a little bit more precision on which payment accounts are being used per each transaction. But I also want to get into catalog defaults. This is where we get the most specific costing, because since you can have a specific expense account for each item in your catalog, we'll actually reference what the default expense account is on that catalog item when we sync to QuickBooks. So that way, if you have several different categories, several different expense accounts that you want to use on one Home Depot expense, it won't always go to that job material that I referenced earlier. You can vary it per individual line. It's very similar when it comes to revenue. We have an accounts receivable that maps to accounts receivable. And instead of a default income account, it actually asks for a default income service. This is because QuickBooks will require a product or service on each line of the invoice. Since Nullified doesn't require a product or service when creating a contract or an invoice, you need to set the default that says, well, QuickBooks needs to use some item, so if you don't use one, which one do you want us to assume it is? This can also be set at the client or even at the job level. So if you want Knowify to skip what the standard income service would be on a specific job and say, well, if it's for this job, you can simply assume that it is a framing, it's framing income as opposed to demolition. Then Knowify can get a little bit more specific for when people aren't using catalog items. And the same goes for payment accounts, where you can say if someone records a payment, an invoice payment in Knowify as opposed to pulling it in from QuickBooks, which bank account you want us to, put the payment into, and then again, you can make it more specific on each individual job, on each individual customer to get a little bit more detailing here. When you're setting up this sync, and you'll see that this all references pages in Knowify, but one of our pages when you're mapping to QuickBooks is called Job Defaults. This is basically where we'll pull in all of your jobs, and then you can choose which class and location is going to be referenced when you push any information regarding that job to QuickBooks. So if you have a bill, if you have invoices, if you have time, and we're creating it in Knowify and pushing it to QuickBooks, it'll also reference that job and use the appropriate class or location that you tag to that job. It's just handy so you don't have to set it on each transaction. It'll just be as you go. Knowify knows which class and location you tag to that project. It automatically carries the information across. Another default that we request is the default service for time. This is going to be for people who are pushing their time from QuickBooks, from Knowify to QuickBooks. Similarly to how the invoices work, QuickBooks will accept a service item to be associated with each entry. Since Knowify doesn't require that, we just need a default to fall back on. Usually someone sets this to a service called labor or a service called hours, and that way it automatically can sync over. But again, you can also name each phase by using your services from your catalog, so it references that item first as opposed to what we had as the default. The last page in your mapping part of Knowify to QuickBooks is what we call catalog defaults. These are actually coming in right from QuickBooks. It's your default income and expense account set for every product and or service. Anytime you make an update to an individual product or service in your Knowify account, it will make the update in QuickBooks. Again, these products and services are bidirectional, so you can always update in QuickBooks. It'll update in Knowify. But one field in Knowify that does need to be set is, at the overall, it'll be at the top of this catalog default screen in Knowify, and that's going to be your overall default income account and expense account for new items added. Since our sync works both directions with your Knowify catalog of products and services, as well as your QuickBooks one, when you add a new item in Knowify, we need to know what you want to use as the income and expense account. Since Knowify doesn't have its own chart of accounts, we expect you to set a default so we have something to assign to it so it can push to QuickBooks without any difficulty. It can always be adjusted very easily. It can be adjusted again in Knowify or in QuickBooks. But this way, when you add new items, things will move back and forth without any issues. Now, this is where I want to get into some of our extra features that people will ask about in Knowify, especially when when we're working with accountants, we find this is some of the most commonly asked requests of Knowify's integration with QuickBooks. And the first one is called jobs as subclients. This is kind of the idea of tracking a project in Knowify, but getting more detail in QuickBooks than just the overall, here's how much we made with this customer. Because maybe you have one customer that you have 20 different jobs with, and you want to see in QuickBooks the 20 different revenue sources. Basically what this does is sets it up so whenever you add a new job in Knowify, in this situation I added a job called Project 905 for my client Carl, it'll act like it's creating a new sub-customer, and it'll push that to QuickBooks. So you can see that I have this corresponding sub-customer in my QuickBooks account, also named Project 905, and it shows that it is a sub-customer of Carl Client. This is useful, again, so when we push an invoice to QuickBooks, we know to use Project 905 so you can track the more specific revenue. But it'll also be useful if you use our other bonus feature, which is pulling expenses from QuickBooks to your Knowify account. The idea behind this is that a lot of different apps integrate with your QuickBooks account. And I bet a lot of them, like Receipt Bank, with Neat, with HubDoc, they're going to be pulling expenses from, or they're going to be pushing expenses to your QuickBooks account from their own system. And so Knowify wants to be able to still accept these into Knowify without you having to double enter them. And so the idea is that if you create a bill in QuickBooks, regardless of whether it was created in QuickBooks or through another software, you can tag a specific customer to the transaction. And if that customer was created by using our Jobs as Subclients feature, in this situation, you can see project 905 is set for this bill. Then when it pulls into Knowify, we have this, we actually can automatically map it into that specific job for the client. Plus, we can also just pull them into what we call the job costing hub, which is what's shown below, where you can reassign anything. So if it wasn't tagged to a customer, you can always just still pull expenses to your Knowify account from QuickBooks and cost it as it hits the account accordingly. Another thing that is still a bonus feature, although it's something that is almost necessary if you're using the bank feed in QuickBooks, it's just the idea of being able to tag a specific payment account when entering a credit card purchase. This way, if you have a purchase that you enter in Knowify with a credit card that matches a transaction that's automatically in your bank feed, QuickBooks can let you match it as opposed to having a duplicate. So it just kind of automates the process. So as long as everyone's entering their expenses against the right card, has the right value and date on it, QuickBooks will say, okay, we recognize this expense. This is probably the same thing. Any of these three features I just covered, again, they need to be enabled by our team at this point in time, but please don't hesitate to reach out. We have guides on how they all work to give you a little bit more information. We're always happy to set up a call, set up training to show you a little bit more about it. And it just takes a couple seconds for our team to enable. So just email support@nullify.com and we'll turn this on for you. But now I want to get into a little bit more detail on managing the actual sync between Knowify and QuickBooks. We have this page, it's part of our QuickBooks module called Transactions. And the Transactions page is more or less an audit trail of everything that's moved back and forth between QuickBooks and Knowify. It's just a way so you can monitor, was this transaction ever attempted to send to QuickBooks? Where did it end up in QuickBooks? And you get a little bit more functionality so you can see, how come this thing that we entered in Knowify never made it to QuickBooks, or where did it end up? You'll also see when you're entering new invoices or bills into Knowify and some payments, you'll have this little checkbox here and there that says send to QuickBooks. We keep it turned on by default, just so nothing accidentally doesn't make it to QuickBooks because someone forgot to check the box. You can uncheck it if it's already been put in QuickBooks or if you don't want to send it for one reason or another. But this is just your way of being able to choose whether or not you want transactions to push. Again, some of the bidirectional items like clients, vendors, products, and services, they just need to be synced in both directions. So you don't have the option. But again, very rarely would anyone actually need the option there. And I mentioned earlier that the Setup Sync button turns into a Sync Now button once you have this all mapped out. What this does is it triggers a pull from QuickBooks to Knowify. Now, Knowify does automatically pull from QuickBooks once a day on your first login for that day or 24-hour period. So you don't always have to trigger this. But if you're doing a lot of work in Knowify and QuickBooks at the same time and you want to update Knowify, you just hit that Sync Now button. It'll be in the bottom right corner of Knowify, and it'll look to see if anything's been updated that needs to be synced up. The last thing I'm showing you here, and this is at the top of this transactions page that I mentioned first here, is the Get Latest Data from QuickBooks Since button. This is more or less the same thing as the Sync Now, but it's a little bit more powerful because it'll let you set a date to pull from. So if someone left their Knowify account idle for a couple days and therefore it hasn't auto-synced, then you can log in a week, 2 weeks later and say, can you get a little bit more data than the standard Sync Now would get? And so if you ever see something that isn't in Knowify and you know it's in QuickBooks and you feel like it should be in Knowify, I always recommend setting this date back about a month just go ahead and hit the sync, and Nullified will look to see if there's anything that's missed in the past for one reason or another. Also, when you're syncing with QuickBooks, you'll get this extra button set on each transaction that should be syncing that just shows you the status of where we stand on this. Sync OK is obviously pretty straightforward. It's just letting you know that the transaction that's been created in Nullified is now in your QuickBooks account. And clicking on Sync OK will actually give you the option to open up QuickBooks to that specific transaction. If it says no sync, oh no, I thought I had a typo here, but maybe not. If it says no sync, it's basically saying at no point did we even attempt to send this to QuickBooks. This basically means that that little box that says send to QuickBooks was unchecked, and it's saying this is something that there's no sync error. It's just not something that's supposed to be synced at this point in time. If the field reads syncing, it means we're still waiting on a response from QuickBooks to tell us whether or not it made it across successfully. This should update pretty quickly. If it's taking too long, refresh your screen. That'll update it to sync OK or hopefully not sync error. And then if anything ever gets stuck syncing, you can reach out to our team, or you can click there and it'll try to push it again. Sometimes things get stuck. It's kind of just the nature of an integration between two software. And then, every now and then we will find that accounts will get sync errors. They're usually pretty straightforward to troubleshoot, and clicking where it says sync error, it'll give you a little bit more information. Most of these are very easy to troubleshoot, and our team can help you. So feel free to reach out to us, and then we'll probably do a webinar in the future on how to troubleshoot some of the most common issues that you'll encounter when it comes to integrating Nullified with QuickBooks. But now I'm going to get into a little bit more of a demonstration period of this to show you a little bit more about what this looks like inside your Nullified account. So here's my account here. And the first thing just that I would like to show you is where you would be connecting Nullified to QuickBooks if it's not part of setup. So I'm going to go to my admin section. There's this little button that looks like a person in the top right corner. I'll click admin section, and we have a tab labeled QuickBooks. So I can come in here, I could disconnect. In fact, I can go ahead and do this now. Now I'm not going to be syncing back and forth between QuickBooks and Nullified. And you see I have this option to connect to QuickBooks. If I'm already logged in, it should automatically prompt me, do you want to connect? It'll say, welcome Taryn, because that's who I'm logged in as. And I can say, actually we need to log into a different account. If you are, obviously using your QBOA account, it'll also prompt you for which of your clients you want to be connecting this account to. Just helps you out a little bit when you're managing that. I'll go ahead and reconnect here. I am successfully reconnected. So that's just where you can get a little bit more information on this. If you ever get a sync error that says, your connection to QuickBooks has expired, you just have to disconnect and reconnect as I did there. As you can see, it takes about 30 seconds, then everything should be syncing up more seamlessly. But when it comes to managing our sync between QuickBooks and Nullified, what I really like to show is this page, this module in Nullified labeled QuickBooks. This is where I can see that transactions page that I had mentioned earlier. And you can see it's currently importing. My account sometimes will get clogged up, so I'm going to let that kind of run for a little bit. This page is really the most important part of understanding the sync between QuickBooks and Nullified, because I can see all the different transactions. Here's a completed transaction. It was a purchase that was created in Nullified. And it was that example that I showed you in my presentation. It was a $14.27 transaction to Amazon.com, which I synced up with my banking feed in QuickBooks. And if I ever need to, I can actually see this transaction in Nullified. So like, let's see, a good example here. So like here's an invoice that was updated in Nullified. If I click on the description column, it'll pull me right to that transaction in my Nullified account so I can see, what's going on with this. What I really want to show you is that this status column, when something has been a completed transaction, I can actually click on where it says complete, and it'll open up my QuickBooks account to that specific transaction. So if I need more information on this, and I can see that something was created in QuickBooks, but I don't know where it is, this is where we would actually be able to manage that. So I can come in here, get a better look at, what's causing the errors here, or sorry, get a better look at, where this item is, where it ended up in Nullified, in QuickBooks from Nullified, the account, and all that information here. For what it's worth, we can also get that same experience if I see, this is actually a status I didn't show you. This is something that was brought from QuickBooks. Obviously, it was brought in from QuickBooks from Knowify, which means that the sync is okay. But I can click here and again get that same view in QuickBooks. And let me find an invoice that doesn't have an error. I set that one up so I could show you guys a little bit more about troubleshooting that error. But anything with these check marks is also successfully synced with QuickBooks. So I can see sync OK, view in QuickBooks. And that way I don't have to search through my QuickBooks account if I have the transaction Nullify. I just hit a couple buttons and now I get to see where we stand. But I mentioned a lot about the mapping of Nullify and QuickBooks, and that's also in this same page. And what I was running through was this expenses defaults, income defaults, job defaults, and catalog defaults. So this is where I was setting my accounts payable in Nullify to what we have in our QuickBooks account. Again, very straightforward there. But this is where I'm saying use uncategorized expense for whenever nothing else is specified. But with ABC Supply, and of course, if it opens that vendor in my QuickBooks account, it's going to go to job materials first, so it's going to ignore uncategorized expense. It's also saying if we don't specify a payment account, please send all payments from Bank of America. But with ABC Supply, it is saving. And that's where I can get more of this functionality of, I want to get more specific than just push everything to these 3 accounts. And that's where we let you manage all of this. And then when we get into our line-by-line expense tracking, that's where these catalog defaults come into play. So if I order something from ABC Supply, Knowify will first look at the individual items. It'll say, look at our catalog defaults. Let's say I order disconnect switch. This goes to electrical. So since there is something set, it's going to use that. But let's say I use this, finishing service for whatever reason. Nothing's set, so it's going to then look to expenses defaults to see what the vendor is. Okay, now it's job material, so it doesn't need to reference that. But if nothing's set here, then it's going to reference uncategorized expense. So it kind of just moves through the funnel of data to make sure that there always is a expense account, and preferably the one that you've set for that individual transaction. Now again, when it comes to income defaults, accounts receivable, very straightforward. But then as I mentioned, a income service instead of a income account. Now obviously this service will have an income account set to it. So if I want to use my chart of accounts to track income, if I come to my catalog defaults and I check out construction services, these all go to sales. And I can update this, or I could say actually my construction services go to sales of product income. And I can actually see that this updated that item. If I come to my transactions, item update from Knowify construction services. And again, you can actually set this at the client level. So construction services is kind of the last resort for Knowify syncing an invoice. But I can say, well, unless it's something that I buy with or something I sell to Wall Street, if that's the case, it's always electrical work, so reference that first. Again, we can also set a default payment account to make sure that everything goes to the correct account here, so we don't have to always reference whatever our bank account would be. You can go to other current asset. I don't know why you would push it to a credit card, but whatever the case is, it'll work here. And then it defaults to showing clients, but if you're using jobs as sub-clients, you click Show Jobs instead, and we'll actually be able to reference those as well. I guess it shouldn't say instead, it should say as well, but you get the idea. When it comes to job defaults, this is where we set our default service for time entries. Again, you can see mine set to hours, but I do have the ability to update that for each per each phase of the job that we're tracking time to. And I can check my classes to say everything from this big building job is actually commercial. The Civil War documentary is home theater installation. Hot Properties is a residential job. And then it'll use these classes when I'm setting up, when I'm actually pushing this information across. And the same goes for location. I can set to our old address of 2 Wall Street or the new Nullified address of 45 Broadway. And just to reiterate, in our catalog defaults, this is actually where you set the default income and expense account for new items added in Knowify. So if I add a new product or service to Knowify, it's going to use the income account of uncategorized income and the expense account of uncategorized expense, but you can reference anything else here as well. So that's how we set up all of these different items and how we map everything out. But now I'll show you a little bit more about what it looks like when we're actually syncing everything across. I'm going to create some transactions. So we'll add a purchase. Purchase orders do not sync. That was covered a lot in our material costing webinar, but the bills that you log against these will sync. I'm just going to go ahead and entirely skip these for now. But I'll say here's a cash expense with Amazon, and it was miscellaneous supplies for $50, and I can actually choose a job here. Now when I submit this, since it's a cash expense, this pushes right to QuickBooks, and I'll be able to see that in my transaction feed. If I do use the credit card feature, and again, this is kind of a bonus feature, I would say expense paid with credit card, and it'll ask which credit card account. So this is pulling in accounts from my bank feed, so I know where to push and match transactions. And again, I do believe I did cover that in my material costing webinar, but if you have more questions on that, please do not hesitate to reach out about it. Now, when I enter a bill into Knowify, again, we're always going to be referencing our defaults. So I'm going to just choose one. I think I have Monmouth Building Center set to have some defaults. We can really get detail in here where I can choose the invoice number. We received the bill yesterday. We have to pay by the 17th. I'm going to keep using 905 because I know that it's synced with QuickBooks right now. I'm going to use a disconnect switch for my catalog, and it's let's call it 50 of these. And I'm going to add another item also on 905, and this is just going to be a non-catalog item, and $10 per unit, and I'm going to get 10 of those. And again, when I submit, I have the option to choose not to send it to QuickBooks. That's when we'll get that no sync status, and I can click here and say, okay, you can send it to QuickBooks now. We're good. Right now I see syncing, and that was actually a pretty fast update. I get sync OK. And if I need to see it in QuickBooks, I can reference it. Just to show you recording payments in Knowify, I can click record payment. We've paid $500 of this bill so far. Again, I have the option to not send to QuickBooks if necessary. But I'll record my payment. That syncs across OK too. And I'll say, all right, show me this bill in QuickBooks. I can see that there's a outstanding balance of $600, and I'm actually going to record the final payment in QuickBooks. Okay, here's a $600 payment that I'd like to log. And you can see that right now the bill is still outstanding in Knowify, since the only payments have been recorded that were recorded in Knowify, although they have synced with QuickBooks, were instantly pushed because it was from Knowify to QuickBooks. The repayment that I just recorded in QuickBooks will need to be triggered. That's where this Sync Now button comes into play. So if I hit that, it's going to automatically pull that payment into my Knowify account, so that way I can have this bill close itself out. This bill is closed and fully paid. Now, when it comes to creating an invoice, I want to show you a little bit more about how we get this, how we get this phase level or line item level sync going. I'm going to choose Advanced as my job, so I can show you a little bit more about how this will work with Plan and Track when we're entering time too. And when I create a job, I'm going to add a new line item where I can add something that isn't in my catalog. I'll just call it demolition. And you can see that I do have demolition, but if I don't select this and I just move on, it's not going to use that item. But now I'm going to say framing. I'm going to make sure to click this item and then put my price in. And again, this little catalog icon that you see here is basically your way of seeing and confirming that this item is a service that has been pulled in from QuickBooks, and we're going to treat it accordingly when we push to your QuickBooks account. I'll go ahead and make this active now. And then I'm going to make an invoice for this. I'll go ahead and invoice 50% of both lines. Verify and finalize. Again, I'm going to send this to QuickBooks. And what this is doing is actually logging a invoice in my QuickBooks account. And this account does have the jobs as subclients feature enabled, which I'm going to show you a little bit more about in a bit. But that means that when we push this, it's not just pushing to the client 45 Broadway, but to the specific sub-customer of Project 906. So I'll say sync OK, view in QuickBooks. And it's going to show me this invoice 221, Project 906, a sub-customer of 45 Broadway. And again, the payment can work in either direction. So if I want to record a partial payment in my QuickBooks account, that works just fine. And when I sync up with my Nullified account, it's going to automatically pull everything back in here. And here's my invoice outstanding, for the remaining $1,500. But I chose advanced so I could show you a little bit more about how the time is going to be interacting with QuickBooks. Now you can see that same catalog pulled over to framing, catalog icon pulled over to framing, and I can click here to see which one it was. Of course, it is framing. And demolition doesn't have one, and this is where the default service for time entries comes into play. So if I'm going to enter time for demolition, and I'll say, Paul spent 4 hours on demolition today, and then also for 906 was doing framing. The one that's set to demolition is going to automatically, the one that is set to demolition is going to reference my job default for my default service for time entries, whereas framing is going to reference framing first because I was more specific when I set up that phase. So we've been doing a lot through Knowify, but I want to show you now the transactions feed and show you a little bit more about what's been going on. Here's when we update our item. That was when we changed the account in our default, or catalog defaults. I can see the 2 purchases that I created in Knowify for Amazon. I can see my bill that was created in Knowify. And again, I can always click complete here and it'll open up in QuickBooks. I can also see a bill payment that was created in Nullified. This was the $500 partial payment, whereas I also have the $600 payment that was pulled in from QuickBooks. And you'll see that a client was created in Nullified, even though I never actually went to clients and added a new client. This is actually that sub-customer that we're working with. So you can see that that actually carried through because when I created an invoice in Nullified, again, completed transaction, but it was for project 906, not for the client 45 Broadway. Even though this is a sub-customer 45 Broadway, this is just our way of seeing, specifically which client it's going to in QuickBooks. I also get to see the invoice payment that pulled in from QuickBooks and 2 4-hour entries for Paul Simon that pushed from Nullified to QuickBooks. So that's just kind of how I get a little bit more of an overview of all this information. And let's see if our time has synced over with the correct catalog items, because sometimes I do this incorrectly. And where is my weekly timesheet these days? There it is. So if I check out the timesheet for Paul, I can see that the one where I didn't specify just went to my default of hours, whereas when I did, it automatically referenced framing. Everything that I've shown you so far in this demonstration portion has all been about creating and Knowify, pushing to QuickBooks, obviously with the exception of payment. But I did mention that there is this bonus feature of being able to pull expenses from QuickBooks to Knowify. So if I enter a new transaction, I'm going to make it a bill in this case. I'll plug in my vendor. This is from Home Depot. What I'm going to do is say, this is the expense account. This is some job materials, miscellaneous supplies, for $500, and this is for customer 906. And then I can say here's also job materials, and this was other miscellaneous supplies, And this is going to be $100, but without a customer. And I show you why I'm doing no customer on this one. When I pull this into Knowify, I'm going to say sync now. See these transactions automatically update into here. Part of this will be automatically allocated to 906 because that's the job that I created in Knowify. We use the jobs as subclients feature set. But what this also does is it pulls it into what we call our job costing hub. This is for if you want to get a little bit more organization out of the expenses that go from QuickBooks to Nullify. I can say show me expenses from QuickBooks only. I can also say show me unallocated only, which means things that don't have jobs associated with it. So that's where that other miscellaneous supplies comes into play. So I know that there are some items that made it to Nullify that were never tagged to jobs. So I have the option of saying, well, actually, this is for 905. We just forgot to label that when we entered into QuickBooks. And so that way I have a little bit more functionality of show me everything that doesn't have a job associated with it. Now I'm going to add it to a job. The job costing hub is definitely a really handy thing. Also, if you have a lot of transactions in QuickBooks that you never set up jobs for in Knowify, this way you can kind of just dice or sort everything out while you go in here and make sure that everything's not just against the right job, but also against the right phase. This is one of the disadvantages of using jobs as subclients when you're using Knowify. You see that this went to 906, but it's automated to demolition. This is some of the more detailed stuff that you get in Knowify when it comes to your job cost reporting, is that you get the phase level reporting of not just how much did I spend on materials, but how much did I spend on demolition materials, how much did I spend on framing materials. If you enter into Knowify and push to QuickBooks, it'll still push to QuickBooks with the corresponding vendor and with the corresponding job name and all of that, but it won't, QuickBooks doesn't have the ability to understand this same demolition, framing, phase level mapping. So if you enter into Knowify, you get that detail, whereas if you enter into QuickBooks, we'll just pull it into the first phase and you'll have to come here and reassign it accordingly. Just something that I like to mention because a lot of people want to ask why anyone would enter stuff into Knowify as opposed to QuickBooks. That's one of the bigger reasons. That's really the most part of what I wanted to show around our standard demonstration of things. But I have a little bit of time. I just want to show you one thing, and it comes to troubleshooting issues. And this is one of the most common things we'll see when it comes to syncing invoices from Knowify to QuickBooks. I created this error earlier, and you see that it says QuickBooks response duplicate invoice number, and I click View Help here to get more information. Basically, it's just saying QuickBooks already has an invoice numbered 210, so you need to use a different number if you want this invoice to sync. So creating this, fixing this error is as easy as opening up this transaction, saying Edit. I believe 222 has not been used yet. Let's find out for sure. And all I did is edit and resave, and then it'll update my sync status again to help me troubleshoot this error. A lot of the fixes are that easy, and you can reach out to our team. We're happy to help you learn how to do it. Again, I do intend on setting up a webinar in the future that's specifically on troubleshooting errors in the sync log. But I just wanted to show that one example because it's one of the most common ones we'll run across. I can see it now. Invoice create Nullify is that. That's really all I wanted to show with the demo portion of this, and that really does conclude our last of the 5 webinar series for our CCAN certification. Again, we will be offering the quiz next week. I forget if it's Monday or Tuesday, but either way, if you're interested in taking it, please shoot an email request to nullify@nullify.com, and we will send you a link to take the test. A passing grade will be getting 75% or more of the questions correct. It is a 50-question test broken down into 5 different 10-question portions that are more or less mimicking our 5-part series. So each section will be on one of the topics that we've covered in our series here. If you don't pass your first time around, it's not a problem at all. Just we'll wait a month, and then you can reach out to us again. We'll resend you the link, and you can take the test again. And basically the only limitation is that you get to take it once a month. That way we give you some time to learn with us in between times that you take it. And then that way we can make sure that you're putting forward a little bit more effort to make sure that we pass the second time around. But we're always happy to do training with you. We're always happy to show you the best parts of these videos to watch. Again, just reach out. Our support team is always extremely helpful and always very happy to help you, so do not hesitate. I want to thank everyone for joining in on this webinar series and for their interest in learning more about Knowify and helping with the Construction Company Advisor Network. Thanks again, and have a nice day.